Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And this time you guys have given us quite the reading list. A
Yeah,
real deep dive into the challenges and potential solutions for a sustainable future.
for sure.
We've got excerpts from Duane Elgin's book, Voluntary Simplicity, packed with historical insights, global trends,
Right.
even glimpses of what a greener world could look like.
It's a good one.
It is a good one.
It's a classic.
And, I have to say, just diving into this, I was really struck by the way Elgin frames the conversation about sustainability.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't just focus on like the environmental stuff, you know.
Right.
He connects it to so many other things like
Yeah.
the economy,
Uh,
social justice,
yeah.
even our own personal values and choices.
Totally. And that's, I think, what makes this book so relevant, even though it was written a while ago. It
Yeah.
feels like it was written for today.
Oh, for sure.
You know what I mean?
Well,
It's
absolutely.
like it's speaking directly to the moment we're in.
Yeah. And one thing that really jumped out at me right away was this idea that we're not just facing like a climate crisis,
Oh, yeah.
but a full-blown world systems crisis.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is a big one. And I think it's important to understand what he means by that, because it's not just about the environment.
Right.
It's about how everything is connected.
Mm-hmm.
The economy,
Yes.
our political systems,
Yeah.
the way we live our lives, it's all part of this larger system that's in trouble.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because we often tend to think of these things as separate issues, like
Right.
climate change is over here and the economy is over there.
Yeah.
But Elgin is really emphasizing that they're all interconnected.
You're like a web.
Mm-hmm.
You pull on one thread and the whole thing starts to unravel.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so complex and so challenging,
Right.
because we can't just address one problem in isolation. We have to look at the whole system.
Yeah, and he outlines 8 major global emergencies in total.
That's a lot.
And it can feel a bit overwhelming.
Oh, for sure.
Like, where do we even begin? But I think the key takeaway is that these are not isolated incidents.
Right.
They're symptoms of a system that's under immense stress.
Exactly. And that's why he calls it a world systems crisis.
He calls it a perfect world storm,
Yeah.
which is not exactly beach weather, is it?
No, not at all.
But I think what's so powerful about Elgin's approach is that he doesn't just leave us with this sense of doom and gloom.
Right.
He actually offers some really compelling solutions. And one of the things that I found most fascinating was this idea of looking to the past for inspiration.
Interesting.
We often think of sustainability as this like new age concept,
Mm-hmm.
but Elgin argues that it's actually deeply rooted in human history and spiritual traditions.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, think about the teachings of Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism,
Yeah.
Taoism, even ancient Greek philosophy. They all emphasize the importance of like balance, moderation, living in harmony with nature.
Yeah. It's not a new idea.
Right.
It's a timeless one.
Yeah, and there's this quote from Lao Tzu that I just love.
Oh, love Lao Tzu.
He says, "He who knows he has enough is rich."
That's so good.
Right. And that was written like over 2,500 years ago.
Wow.
And it's still so relevant today,
It really is.
especially in a world that's constantly telling us we need more, more, more.
Yes. Constantly bombarded with messages to buy more, consume more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what if we already have enough?
It's a powerful question.
It is.
And it's one that I think we all need to be asking ourselves.
So we've got this world systems crisis looming over us.
Mm-hmm.
But history shows us there's another way.
Mm-hmm.
And Elgin lays out these 2 contrasting scenarios for the future. A bleak crash where we fail to adapt,
Yeah.
and a more hopeful bounce where we make conscious changes.
I like the sound of the bounce.
The bounce sounds a lot better.
Yeah, right. Definitely.
So let's talk about the crash first, because I think it's important to understand, what's at stake.
Okay.
So Elgin describes this scenario where societies are collapsing.
Oh, wow.
There's competition for dwindling resources, and it's basically every nation for itself.
That sounds pretty scary.
It does. It's a grim picture of what could happen if we just keep doing what we're doing.
Right, if we cling to the status quo.
Exactly. But then there's the bounce.
Okay.
And this is where things start to get a little bit more hopeful.
Goodness.
So in this scenario, humanity kind of hits rock bottom,
Uh-huh.
but then we collectively wake up
Okay.
and we realize that we need to change.
We need change.
And we start working together
Okay.
to create a more sustainable and equitable future.
I like that much better.
It is a much better scenario, right?
Yeah.
And one of the key differences between the crash and the bounce is the role of communication and technology.
Oh.
So in the crash scenario, technology is kind of used to control people
Uh-huh.
and to spread misinformation.
Right.
But in the bounce scenario, it becomes a tool for positive change,
Okay.
for spreading awareness,
Yeah.
and for connecting people across the globe.
So it's about using technology more consciously
Exactly.
and intentionally.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because technology can be a double-edged sword.
It can be.
It can be used for good or for bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's up to us to decide how we want to use it.
To shape it.
Yeah, and I think Elgin is really optimistic about the potential for technology to help us create a better future.
Yeah, me too.
But it's not a given. We have to be intentional about it.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a good place to pause. For now,
Okay.
we've laid out the groundwork. We've talked about the challenges, the stakes, the potential solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And in the next part, we're going to dive deeper into some of those solutions.
Sounds good.
We're going to talk about what conscious simplicity looks like in practice,
Right.
how it can transform our lives, our communities,
Yeah.
and ultimately the world.
I'm excited to dive in.
Me too. So stay tuned. All right, so we just painted a pretty stark picture of the challenges we're facing.
Yeah, kind of a heavy start.
It is, but the good news is Elgin doesn't just leave us hanging there.
Right.
He offers some real tangible solutions. And one that I found really intriguing was this idea of conscious simplicity.
Oh, yeah. It's a great concept.
So what does that even mean? What does
Well,
that look like in the real world?
Well, it's kind of like a multifaceted approach. It touches on so many different aspects of our lives.
Okay.
For starters, it's about simplifying our lifestyles,
Okay.
consuming less, focusing on experiences rather than possessions.
So kind of like a minimalist approach.
Yeah, exactly like Marie Kondo for your life.
I love that analogy.
It's about identifying what truly brings you joy
Uh-huh.
and cutting out the rest, whether that's clutter,
Okay.
commitments, or even negative thoughts.
So it's not just about getting rid of stuff.
Yeah.
It's about being more mindful about what we allow into our lives.
Exactly. It's about making conscious choices
Okay.
that align with a more sustainable and fulfilling life.
So it's not about deprivation.
No, not at all.
It's about being intentional.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. So how does that play out on a community level?
Well, Elgin talks about the importance of building stronger local networks.
Okay.
Sharing resources, supporting sustainable businesses.
So the buy local movement.
Yeah, exactly. It's about creating more resilient communities
Uh-huh.
that are less reliant on this globalized system.
Okay. And what about on a global scale?
Mm-hmm.
How does conscious simplicity address these big systemic issues?
Well, it's about fostering global cooperation, promoting equity and fairness, redefining progress beyond just economic growth.
So it's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
It is.
It's about moving away from this kind of me-first mentality
Mm-hmm.
and embracing a more holistic worldview.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected.
Yeah, it's interesting. Elgin uses this analogy of humanity being in its teenage years.
Oh, I like that.
And he's like, we're kind of going through this rebellious phase. We're consuming everything in sight.
Yeah.
We're not thinking about the consequences.
Right. We're not cleaning up after ourselves.
Exactly. But he's hopeful that we can mature as a species.
Okay.
We can grow out of this phase
Yeah.
and become more responsible stewards of the planet.
I hope so.
Me too. And, I think conscious simplicity is a really powerful framework for that transition.
Is.
Because it's not just about changing our external systems.
Right.
It's about changing ourselves.
It's an inside job.
It is. It's about shifting our values, our
Mhm.
priorities, our whole way of being in the world.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it so challenging, but also so exciting.
Yeah, because it's not just about doing less.
Right.
It's about being more,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
more mindful, more compassionate,
Yeah.
more connected.
Absolutely. And I think that's a message that really resonates with people,
Yeah.
especially in today's world where there's so much anxiety and uncertainty.
Right. People are looking for meaning. They're looking for purpose.
You're looking for connection.
And I think conscious simplicity offers a path to all of those things.
I think so too.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about all these big ideas, these global challenges,
Right.
this need for a pretty fundamental shift in our values and priorities.
It can feel a little overwhelming.
It can, and I think a lot of people are probably wondering, okay, that's all well and good, but what can I actually do?
Right. Like, how do we translate these big ideas into concrete actions?
Exactly, and I think that's where Elgin really shines.
Mm.
He doesn't just leave us with this kind of philosophical overview. He actually offers some really practical advice, and he breaks it down into these three levels: personal, community, and global.
Oh, that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah. So let's start with the personal level.
Sure.
What are some things that individuals can do to embrace conscious simplicity?
Well, for starters, it's about really examining our consumption habits.
Okay.
Asking ourselves, do we really need all this stuff?
Right.
Can we simplify our lifestyles?
And I think that's a really important first step, because it's easy to get caught up in this consumerist culture
Oh, absolutely.
where we're constantly bombarded with messages telling us to buy more, buy more, buy more.
Yeah, it's like we're programmed to consume.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think the first step is just to become aware of that programming and to start questioning it.
Yeah, and then we can start making more conscious choices about what we buy,
Right.
where we buy it from, how much we consume.
And it doesn't have to be like this huge, drastic change. It can start with small things like bringing your own reusable bags to the grocery store.
Yeah.
Or choosing to repair something instead of just throwing it away and buying a new one.
Exactly. Or cooking more meals at home instead of eating out all the time.
Those are all great examples, and I think the key is to find what works for you. What feels manageable and sustainable in your own life.
And don't try to do everything at once.
Right. It's a journey.
It is.
And it's about taking small steps in the right direction.
And celebrating those small victories.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the personal level. Now let's move on to the community level.
Yeah.
What are some things that we can do collectively to create more sustainable communities?
Well, Elgin talks about the importance of building stronger local networks.
Okay.
Supporting local businesses, getting involved in community gardens.
Right. Creating more opportunities for sharing and collaboration.
Exactly. It's about building resilience at the local level.
And I think that's so important, because when we rely too heavily on these global systems, we become really vulnerable.
Right, to disruptions in the supply chain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So by strengthening our local communities, we're creating a safety net.
Yeah, a buffer against those global shocks.
Okay, so we've talked about personal change, community change. Now let's zoom out even further and talk about the global level. What can we do to address these big systemic issues like climate change and economic inequality?
Well, Elgin talks about the importance of conscious democracy. Getting involved in the political process, advocating for policies that support sustainability, and holding our leaders accountable.
Exactly. And I think this is where it can feel really daunting,
It can.
Like one person can't really make a difference.
Right. But Elgin argues that collective action is the only way to create real systemic change.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, when people come together.
Yeah. And they raise their voices. They can move mountains.
Absolutely. And we've seen that throughout history.
We have.
The civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement.
Right.
All of these movements started with ordinary people coming together.
Yeah.
And demanding change.
And that's what we need now.
We need a global movement for sustainability. And I think Elgin's work offers a really powerful roadmap for that movement.
It does.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into voluntary simplicity, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We've talked about the challenges, the solutions, the personal, the community, the global. But ultimately, it all comes down to this one fundamental question.
What's that?
What kind of world do we want to create?
That's a good question.
It is. And I think Elgin's work is a call to action.
Yeah.
It's a challenge for us to step up, to become more conscious, more compassionate, more connected.
More intentional.
And to start creating the world that we want to live in.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
Yeah, I think so too.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we hope you'll continue to explore these ideas.
Yeah.
And to find ways to bring them into your own life.
So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a more conscious and compassionate world.